Thanks so much for coming today. So we're going to talk today about special education needs, and in particular we're going to be thinking about how new principals, new head teachers, what the things they really need to know about identifying what support is needed, and therefore what baseline assessments are needed in order to accommodate every child, because we want to make sure every single child is catered for. So could you just briefly outline for us what are the baseline assessments that you use, and then how do you use that information to decide on what interventions need to then happen?
Yeah, it's a really large question, and something that will be slightly different in every setting, but particularly at Harris Peckham, where we've got a really diverse population of students. We've had to be quite creative in the number of baseline assessments that we have, but for everywhere it will be about starting with a universal screener first for every student coming into the academy or into the setting from primary school. And those screeners, particularly in baseline assessments, will be most useful as computer-based assessments. There's quite a lot out there. We particularly use a form of Lucid Exact, as well as some Lucid Rapid tests, and a combination of an NGRT reading comprehension test. And the benefit we have of that is every single student can do that before entering the academy. So we get a really wide knowledge of our students. At a very general level, though, it's important to note at that stage. So we're able to identify students who require further testing. That testing doesn't give us everything we need to know for specialist support. What it also means, if you've got quite a transient sort of population or lots of in-year admissions, you have a system in place that means they sit those tests before they've walked in the door as well, so that no student falls through the net as they're coming in. That initial stage of testing then is also really useful for staff, because it eases workload. It's all self-marked on the computers, and therefore you're able to very quickly gather that information. With that, quite a lot of the students will come up scoring brilliantly across all realms, and it's important to look at those tests as a holistic package and not just look at the results in one of those tests. Students that are scoring across the board, you then know with really great high quality teaching and a really great teaching and learning provision will be well catered for in the classroom. However, it will then identify students who are scoring in specific areas lower than 85, who require additional testing, or more on that borderline 90. I'd still be looking at making sure they've had some additional tests to be able to make sure we haven't missed something, or they just fluked a test on that day. We all know students can have a bad day, but some can also have luck on their side, and we don't want that to happen and students to fall through the net. So then starting to look at, as those students have come through, it's really important then to have someone within your setting who can facilitate some further testing on some more specialist standardised tests. We particularly at that point use the Access Reading Test if they've scored particularly around their reading comprehension. The benefit of their Access Reading Test is it differentiates between whether it's a vocabulary issue, an analysis issue, or an inference issue, which is why it's really important that test isn't just done by someone who's not going to be able to pick apart those scores and really identify the specific need. We also use the CTOP around processing speed. Some students will score really low on those initial tests, but not because their reading accuracy ability is low, but they may come up on the NGRT test as being low, but actually with extra time and processing support, their reading skills are fine. So to place them in a reading intervention almost wouldn't help the core root problem. So having the CTOP there is a really useful test to have as well as the DASH test. One thing the computer-based screeners don't pick up on is speed of writing, and the sort of free writing ability, the ability to think of ideas. And if we're thinking about when a child's in a lesson and really struggling, sometimes that could be the barrier, and that time. So the DASH can be a really useful tool to add from that. that may not be picked up on the initial screener through those tests that we use, but teachers are really useful as baseline assessments for that within that first half term, particularly of year 7s coming in, and then revisiting throughout the year of the 5 years you have students with you, or even at sixth form, picking up on students who may find writing really difficult, or actually
Of course.
they're planning, they can't, the most common one is students know the answer to talk to me and then they just can't get it on the page. So teachers can be a really useful form to supplement that additional targeted level of testing. And what that then will help to do is identify which interventions those students from the initial screener need to go into. Because I think sometimes it can become, right, okay, we'll put them in a literacy intervention, and that's great, but is it hitting on the vocabulary need or the analysis need? And if a student struggles with word finding skills, having them solely focusing on inference isn't necessarily going to improve their inference if we haven't looked at that first skill first.
So you make sure that you've got a very wide and deep range of baseline assessments, and also an expert to then analyse what that actually means for individual students. And what you're saying is that what the surface of those baseline assessments, even though they're sophisticated SEN ones, won't directly signpost you to the intervention. It takes quite a bit more discussion and interrogation of that information.
Absolutely, and I think at that point it's sometimes about being so forensic and looking then possibly at 5 tests a student has done, and looking at a real package of support around those students. And I think what can be really interesting there after that interrogation is there will still be some students that you feel, I'm not entirely certain I've got the intervention needed here, or it's such a complex case clearly of so many different needs. And that's where it's going to be really important to then have a next level of a specialist external who can also then build a package of intervention around that child, whether that be a speech and language therapist or an educational psychologist, beginning to look alongside your SENCO at what we need to move forward. It may be for an individual, or as we know, cohorts change year on year. It may be that one year you've got a really small cohort of 3 that will need roughly the same thing. And the following year you won't. So that could be a very interesting way of needing to have sort of maybe a service level agreement with your EP that can change year on year for the amount of support and days that you need for that further assessment. And
to flex for the needs of those students. So I think most colleagues will know that with the EHCP, the funding, although it is quite complicated, it's a legal document, and there is a finite amount of funding that's associated with that. Sometimes difficulty can come with the targeted and specialist for your K students, your SEN support students. What would you advise a new head, or what procedures do you think should be gone through to help identify where should this budget be spent?
I think you're absolutely right. The budget aspect is really, really difficult, and even when you look at that specialist aspect, that's an even more complex minefield that's not normally fulfilled, despite having a legal document. But particularly with those K students and around the notional funding that's provided to schools, there's a difficulty there when there's some tension between you're told you've got this whole budget of SEN notional funding, but actually when you dig deeper into that, that number is based on the deprivation index and low key stage 2 scores that come through the academy, and actually the SEND register is decided by the SENCO in the school alongside the senior team. So you may have 109 SEN students, and your SEN notional budget doesn't reflect that, because it's not actually based on the number of SEN students you have in your school, which can be a really, really difficult decision-making process to make. Thinking around looking at a 5-year cohort, if we think year 7 to 11, and the national figures, my initial sort of thought process is around what's the greatest need and what are you likely that need isn't going to go away for 5 years for things that you are going to need at K level for a long period of time. Things like TA support can be really useful, but we know they're a really expensive resource, and unless used correctly may not add the value and support to those students that you need. But thinking around speech and language therapists, most local authorities, particularly in London, don't have a huge amount of scope to provide the speech and language therapy that's, say, written in a plan, or that actually our K students need to prevent them from falling through the net and not making any progress and possibly coming up as needing an EHCP later down the line. So if you know that speech and language needs are the largest in your school, and given the fact that they're so high nationally, it would probably reflect most settings, beginning to look at, okay, can we afford that out of some of our notional budget? Some of it will be topped up probably through your EHCPs, who get top-up funding for that support, but looking initially there. And also being a little creative in the speech and language service that you buy into, I think is going to be really important, because some are really well trained in areas of autism and providing and building a package of interventions. Others will be focused very specifically around literacy and language needs. And if you know that you're going to be needing to pull on them and be creative for a whole K register, for things like social communication that's coming up, particularly in year 7s and transitions, making sure you've really sort of decided who you're spending that money on, so they've got a breadth of skills that can be pulled on. But there are some difficulties in managing that caseload with the speech and language therapist, and that sort of compromise has to be made at that point of who is being seen, because there's only a finite amount of time.
Yes.
So I think in terms of K students, that could be quite difficult, but with language being quite a key priority, that's something there. And also looking at the sort of social and emotional mental health needs within that register, even if it's not coming up as a priority or your main need, actually thinking that anyone with a language difficulty, anyone who is struggling in their learning due to literacy needs or numeracy needs, they're going to have an element of low self-esteem, and starting to think about how you build a package around that, and does some of your notional funding cover a support provided within school, whether that be a member of staff who's already there going on specialist training to be able to provide interventions for those students, and be a bit of a sort of constant key adult support, or is it someone more specialist that needs to be brought in for 1 day a week or 2 days a week, and making that judgment based on your register of students.
So it's a bit of a balancing act overall, isn't it? Meeting the needs of the students, meeting within a tight budget, which takes me therefore to the principles of the intervention mapping. So you've got your funding, you know what the cohort is for any given year. What would you summarise briefly as being the principles that you have got to consider when you're creating an intervention map?
Start with outcomes. What do you want from these students, and what is a reasonable and ambitious decision for that particular student or cohort of students? So starting at the end, what do you really, really need from them by the end, and map the provision backwards to make sure that actually they have every chance of getting there, and that our expectations of these students aren't lowered. So starting with outcomes, starting to think then of where they're at the moment, because actually some students will be at very different levels. Having a speech and language difficulty or dyslexia actually may not mean you need literacy intervention at that point. You may actually be performing with skills within a lesson and achieving really well. So we go back to that kind of individual package around a student. So a provision map has to then be able to build a picture around the individuals that you can then group into cohorts for providing intervention. Within that then, in a really accessible form, I think it's so important to be able to have their package of assessments available in that, so that we can't hold in mind 200 students' assessment results, but when we go to their provision, we can just re-glimpse at, okay, what did they all score? Why did we make these decisions in the first place? That's why, okay, here's the outcome. This is what we've currently got in place at the moment, and having space within that provision map to review that on a sort of 6-weekly 12-weekly basis, depending on the intervention. And that's not to say there'll be hard numbers every 6 weeks. That's not going to be useful for a lot of SEN interventions, but that there is qualitative feedback around progress towards the outcome that you've identified. And some specific examples, maybe if we're working with a particular student who has got all the way to year 7 and hasn't secured the phonic code, actually at the end of 6 weeks, which of the phonic code has he been able to now master, and having that within that provision map, so that you can very quickly draw on, okay, we're still actually working on the CVC sounds and we haven't mastered that yet. But the outcome that we really want is that actually we've got all the CVC words, all the sounds, and we're moving on to graphemes and phonemes by the end of 6 months. And then you might have some raw data to go with the baselines as well towards the end of that. So I think it's important that the provision map of a whole school encompasses all of that.
Yes, so it's quite a task. So there's inevitably, any given year group will have a certain amount of SEN students in it, and decisions have got to be made about groupings. Different schools will have different models, might be streaming, might be setting. What are the sort of thought processes, decision making needs to go through when you're considering where to group your SEN students?
It's a really, really challenging one, because one sort of default that's been a negative of the system and documented sort of in previous years is that there's an assumption that SEN students are weak and low ability, and it gets grouped in that same context. We now know, and we've come a really long way, that's absolutely not the case. And so now it's about thinking of them at an individual level. Some of our students will be performing really, really highly despite their SEN needs. Some will be performing not to their ability because elements of their SEN needs aren't being met. So I'm thinking autism particularly here. Some of our students could be doing exceptionally well in their lessons, but due to sensory difficulties, emotional and mental health difficulties, and anxiety around the lesson, that's preventing their progress. And I think it's really important to think at that point it's not about moving them, if you've got a setting or streaming system, out of that, but finding ways to meet their needs within a higher group. Some will have chosen nurture groups, or have sets, and therefore there's low ability students or within it. It's important to realise they might not all be SEN. Having sets can have massive impacts and positives on distributing human resources such as TAs, because we know from the budget sort of element we may not be able to have a TA everywhere we want them, and that's not always useful, but actually having students who all require that support in one place can be really useful. That does then have some repercussions as to whether behaviour is a difficulty, and I think particularly there leading to the teachers that are teaching that group. There's some really complex decisions around timetable of each department. Are your strongest teachers in there if we're saying these students are struggling the most and need to make the most progress at the moment, and have they had adequate training? So definitely some timetabling and human resource questions if we're going with setting. Mixed ability can then prove its own difficulties that staff find. Humanities subjects across many settings seem to have had most practice in that, and it seems to be really common practice, certainly in the schools I've been in, and they've got some real expertise that they could be sharing with other subjects around how to differentiate a curriculum that doesn't require creating 14 different sections of a lesson for different people. So I think I would certainly be looking at staff training around some of the ways to overcome the barriers that could be encountered, whether it be mixed ability or setted groups. I certainly also think changing a culture and perception around SEN within a setting is really, really important if you are going to have sets or streams, because it can become very easy to start thinking they're low ability and they will struggle to achieve a certain thing. We need really high expectations for them, going back to that provision map of having a really clear, ambitious outcome at the end, and that they are shared with teachers as well of those groupings. But it can be a difficulty with timetable. If you are trying to move staff around to be in the right place, you may not be able to have your most experienced member of staff with the adequate training teaching that group. So there are lots of challenges around grouping.
So could you maybe touch on, therefore, and in any given school that have to be different decisions made by different department areas depending on whether they are mixed ability or set. So therefore, doesn't quality first teaching become something that is crucial to make sure that that universal offer is being met? And do you want to just tell us a little bit about what the key components, and just quite brief please, of what are the key components of quality first teaching that need to be in every school?
I think it's at the heart, so absolutely. And I think particularly if we are thinking of all lessons, at the absolute heart it's accessibility for students, and looking at everyone as a human, and we all struggle if there's lots of information. So it's actually about sort of stripping back what's the key piece of knowledge that our young people need to learn in that lesson, and how do I make sure they've got it. And that would be my key component of quality first teaching first in the planning, before your teachers have even got in the classroom. Because if they can't identify what that one key piece of knowledge is, there's going to be lots of students walking away without it. And then starting to decide, okay, how do I best get this one piece across? And if we're delivering through PowerPoints, or we're delivering through other technology, is there lots of things that are distracting actually within that? And that's sometimes not just SEN students who become distracted by that. Are there images that support it but don't just add something that looks quite nice because we think it's going to be really engaging? So I would also then start to consider resources, anything that's going to be handed out to support that. Going back to what's the one key piece that I need all students to know, are those resources highlighting that one key piece? Is it a resource that I need to use all my cognitive energy to decode, and actually the one piece of knowledge I needed was just at the end of it, and I could have been relieved of some of that pressure, and possibly retained it better had I not had to go through this sifting of filling in columns or reading lots of information that wasn't supportive of that. Lots of strategies around accessibility that you could go into for quality first teaching, around things like font size, things such as when information is delivered to students, making sure that it's got space around the white edge of the white space, that teachers can do without having to plan 5 different lessons. And the dual coding for teachers book is fantastic, and I think all staff in terms of quality first teaching should read it. And that would be a springboard for any setting, no matter whether you've got groups or setting or mixed ability, an absolute springboard for really great quality resources and delivery of lessons before you go into the personalised things that students might need, like chunking and highlighting and other aspects on the board.